All right, welcome. This is a very quick review of the 13 British colonies, focusing on regions and the unique characteristics of each of the 13 colonial regions. We're going to look at New England, which consisted of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the Middle Atlantic region of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Starting with New England was home to religious refugees who were escaping religious persecution in Europe. Technically, there's two types of religious refugees that settled in New England. The first group, the more famous group, is the smaller of the two. They're separatists from the Church of England called the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came over in 1620 on the ship called the Mayflower. They're the ones that landed on Plymouth Rock. And essentially, they were called separatists because they were so unhappy with the Church of England. They were so unhappy with Europe that they were divorcing themselves essentially from the Church of England and from Europe and coming to America to worship freely with no ties, no connections anymore to the corruption of Europe. They're the ones that when they come, they will sign what's called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is an agreement by the small group of separatists that they would make rules for themselves, that they would look after themselves, that they would abide by the rules that they set for themselves. And this was really the formation of self-government. And we'll see that later come into this idea of a covenant community. The Puritans were the larger of the two groups of religious refugees. They come in the 1630s. They're non-separatist, and what they want to do is purify. That's why they're called Puritans. They wanted to reform the Church of England. They wanted to set up a city on the hill in just north of where Plymouth was in Massachusetts Bay in Massachusetts. And later they'll be the founders of Boston. The city of Boston will come from the Puritan influence. They're ascribers to John Calvin. John Calvin taught the doctrine of predestination, that there were only a few saints who were truly destined for heaven, and that only God really knew who those saints were. So when they came to New England and settled in Massachusetts, the idea of the Mayflower Compact of self-government kind of fed into their beliefs too, that they would be a community of worshipers, that they would look after each other as saints, to be this perfect city on a hill and shame the Church of England into changing its ways. This idea of a covenant community shaped everything from society to government. In their government, they would have town meetings, which is a small sort of direct form of democracy, kind of old Athens style. The only thing is you had to be a member of the church. If you weren't a saint, you could not participate in government. You could not participate in these town hall meetings because, again, if you weren't a saint, you weren't a member of the covenant, the promise that had been made to look after each other and to make rules for each other. So you were kind of an outsider if you weren't a member of the church. So it's ironic, I guess, when you think about New England was founded for religious freedom, but they were not very tolerant to people who were not a part of the sainthood of those who were members of the church. They were very hardworking, very thrifty, not very showy in their ways. Their churches were very plain because their focus was on worship. If you did question the church, you would be kicked out. They were very intolerant of those who were dissenters, those who went against the grain. One example would be Roger Williams. He questioned whether or not the church should be mixing church business and government mixing. Should you have to be a member of the church to make decisions in government? Were people joining the church just to have political power? He was concerned about that. He was banished for questioning these practices and would go on to found the colony just to the south of Massachusetts called Rhode Island. And it's aptly called because it becomes the colony of the rogues or the outlaws, the dissenters who are kicked out and can't live in Massachusetts, and they go on to live in Rhode Island. In terms of economy, the climate, the environment really affects what is practiced in New England. It's primarily a small subsistence farming, family farms to subsist, to live, not large plantations. You're not going to have cash crops that far north. It's too cold, it's too rocky. It's primarily those subsistence farms to feed your family, and your family is primarily your workforce. Cold codfish right outside of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So fishing, tall pine trees go into the lumbering business, which goes into the shipbuilding industry, and eventually the rivers, the fast flowing rivers of New England will be the basis of energy for our early textile mills, which will take off in New England. We'll talk about that eventually. So that's an overview of New England. As far as the Middle Atlantic region, it's the most diverse. It's literally in the middle of the two extremes. You got a diversity of immigrants that are coming in from different parts of Northern and Western Europe, English, Dutch, German. They're coming for religious reasons. They're coming for economic reasons. It's a very tolerant area. It's a very flexible social structure area. You could start out poor and then kind of move up in status over time. The Quakers who settled Pennsylvania, founded by Quaker William Penn, really kind of set the tone for this toleration. Quakers believed that everybody was equal, that everybody had a bit of the inner light, had God in them, and really tried to treat everybody fairly, even the Indians. They bought the Indians, the land from the Indians when Philadelphia was set up, the city of brotherly love. So Quakers, a society of friends, sort of set the tone for that area. Just to the north, the French Huguenots, who could not settle in Catholic New France, could come to New York. The Jews could come to New York. In New Jersey, another area of religious toleration, the Presbyterians will settle. Middle Atlantic, home to a lot of middle class artisans like shoemakers and coopers and entrepreneurs, business people. You could find opportunities in the Middle Atlantic regions to start your business. In fact, Benjamin Franklin is going to be one of those young men who moves to Philadelphia from New England, and he comes down to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and starts a print shop, and of course goes on to be one of our founding fathers and most important leaders of the early American period. As far as economics, they share a couple of similarities to New England in terms of small subsistence farms. Shipbuilding are common, and then they're unique in that they have commercial trade centers. New York City, Philadelphia, both on deep water river channels, develop into major cities of the colonial period and very important commercial seaports. So that's unique to the Middle Atlantic region. So very diverse, very tolerant. If you wanted to go anywhere, probably Middle Atlantic place was the most free and most democratic and less constraining of all the regions. And then last but not least, home, the southern colonies. Virginia is where it really all started in 1607. Jamestown was founded as a company venture, a joint stock company of investors who were hoping to make a lot of money, much like the Spanish had to the south. Of course, they were not able to find gold in Virginia, but they found something that was almost just as good. Tobacco, a cash crop, which became known as the brown gold of Virginia, and it enticed people to keep coming to Virginia and kind of set the tone for what Virginia would look like and how its economy would be run and even its social structure would be run. A lot of wealthy planters who owned these large plantations in eastern Virginia and down into the Carolinas and the Low Country. In fact, the king would reward loyal supporters, the English nobility called the Cavaliers, with land in eastern Virginia. In fact, that's where UVA, University of Virginia, gets its mascot, is the Cavalier. So wealthy people in the east, poorer people in the western part, the Shenandoah Valley, the mountains closer where we are in the western part of the state. The Scots-Irish lived, more subsistence farming in the backcountry, hunting and small trade to kind of make ends meet. It's really the eastern part of the state with the Cavaliers that you see the large plantations and the wealth in the plantations where it's more hot and humid environment. Even the government, which we most associate in Virginia with our early House of Burgesses, which is our oldest in the Western Hemisphere freely elected assembly. A Burgesses is actually a representative from the burghs, from the districts, as Virginia grew up. A lot of wealthy planters elected to go to Jamestown, then of course later to Williamsburg, our colonial capital, to represent Virginia. So little different than what we saw in New England. New England was small, community-based, covenant community, town halls, church membership. Here in Virginia, Virginia starts to spread out, and you have these elected burgesses go to represent you in Williamsburg. So more of a representative form of government in the South. And of course, as far as labor on these tobacco plantations, we have indentured servants initially filling that role. This is a contracted form of labor. So you've got poor people who are English or Irish or Scottish who are signing a contract to work, usually for a period of about 7 years on tobacco plantations. And after 7 years, if you live that long, you would be free and maybe even have the opportunity to own some land. In 1619, the first Africans are brought unwillingly. Of course, they didn't sign a contract, and they're brought from Africa across what's called the Middle Passage on board these slave ships, and then they're sold in the southern colonies, of course, down in the Caribbean, the Spanish colonies as well, as a labor source. And over time, Africans will increasingly arrive, and race-based slavery will develop. So unlike indentured servants who signed a contract and would eventually work off their debt in return for their chance to come to Virginia, the African slaves were brought unwillingly across the Middle Passage on these slave ships and eventually are held in bondage for a period of life. And it's passed down from mother to child as the laws change in Virginia. So labor is totally based, society is totally based on the development of cash crops and the way Virginia develops from its earliest period. All right, that doesn't cover everything, but that's a basic overview of the 3 British colonies. Please review your notes and your practice questions to dig a little deeper. Thanks.